Hello everyone, Religious Fanboy here again, and today we are discussing the Christian lessons, themes that are paralleled in the lessons and themes of the last episode of Erase, episode 12, where we will be talking about the topics of selflessness, relying on others, and the long-awaited answers to prayers. The passage for today is from James chapter 5 verses 7 8. Book of James is thought to have been written by James, the half brother of Jesus, written to the original audience being Christians in Israel. This is thought to be one of the earlier books to be written in the new that make up the New Testament, written as a way of encouraging Christians, giving them advice on how to operate and be like Christ given the difficult situation in Rome. This, if it was, this would be either within the time of Nero or close to it. And we could assume this based on how some of the earlier books of the New Testament were written and why. Specifically, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, which is thought to have been written by Mark, but heavily based on based on the memories of Peter's memories of Jesus and their ministry. And also in the history, the martyrdom of Peter is thought to have been carried out and or ordered by Emperor Nero, which would allow us to believe that since Mark was another one of the books, it might have been written around the start of Nero's reign or a little ways before that, possibly an emperor before Nero. Don't remember who that is. But there is the context for the passage. We also see earlier on in the passage how the wealthy are being condemned at the start. And James uses a lot of phrasing from Ecclesiastes, talking about moths eating the gold and eating the fancy clothes, and the gold being corroded and corroding. Very similar to the metaphors that Solomon is thought to have used in the book of Ecclesiastes. But the verses that we will be focusing on primarily today are verses 7, 8, which says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also Be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. We see the idea of long awaited prayers and the concept and situation of the long awaited answers to prayers and the receiving of those through how it is paralleled in this episode, seeing how everything is wrapped up and how though Satoru was put in a coma, him as well as everyone involved in situations in the show, we see how all of them have benefited and had gotten what they desired. Kaio was really was delivered from her abusive mother and was able to start a family with Hiromi, and they got married and had a child during the 15 years that Satoru was in a coma, and Kenya became detective inspired to continue to do what he had been doing as a kid, helping Satoru, and they worked together to catch Yashiro in this episode after Satoru tells lets him know that he has gotten his memories back. Um, and we also see in this episode how, like the rich that are being condemned in James chapter 5 in the beginning, so Yashiro was like the rich who relied so much on their wealth and status, symbolized by the clothes and the gold that is talked about being destroyed. Yashiro was focused only on his own interests, and killing, and because of Satoru not dying, Satoru indirectly prevented these future murders that would have happened, these other murders that Yashiro had done in the, or is expected to have done in the original timeline, but also through that and his almost attempt at suicide, that he had his void and pursued to fill his void had left him empty and lost, even to the point where he had he contemplates in this episode suicide after he realized that when he was aware that Satoru did not need him, but he needed Satoru to live and have a sense of direction. And on the contrary, through the talking about the idea of the long awaited answers to prayers, in the previous, earlier on in the show, we had heard about these letters that all the kids wrote about their hopes and dreams, and Satoru's he talked about a hero in an anime that he had watched where the final battle is very similar and is a good metaphor for Satoru's experiences throughout the series. And when talking about that, he brings up how in the show that he had watched, it was after the hero had tried so hard on by his by himself and could not do it that his friends intervened and helped him over beat the bad guy and overcome the hopeless situation. And he voiced his feelings that he felt like he didn't have that type those types of good close friends, and but through the actions and his willingness to accept help and be honest with Kenya and Hiromi and Kyle through these previous two attempts at time travel to save Hiromi and Kyle and the other girl and his mom, how even though he was in a coma for 15 years, he had developed good and strong relation with friends that were supportive when they were hanging out regularly, but also supportive throughout his coma, such as even the person that they had conflicts with, even helping them to raise money for the hospital bills. And even though it wasn't in a desired way, and usually when we call for God ask to ask him to help us grow, it's not gonna be fun initially. Spiritual growth is a lot like exercising, where for you to be strong in your relationship with God and strong with willpower and faith, it has to be tested. And the way it gets stronger is by those muscles, like our physical muscles when working out, being torn repeatedly and stretched and being healed, because as our muscles go through the cycle of being stretched and torn and then healed, every time it recovers from being torn, it becomes stronger. And that's what we see here throughout the show, and coming to conclusion here, where Satoru goes from someone who feels like he did not have friends and someone who was afraid to go and think too in be too deep into his own head and be alone with his thoughts, to someone that can write openly and honestly and from the heart in his mangas, because he was able to protect the people that he wished he could have protect. And this could also be understood as a completion of his guilt through the line in the epilogue in the end where he said that he hadn't, since coming out of the coma, he hadn't experienced another revival. We do see the revival butterfly appear again at the very end, but it is very vague of what the situation is. I hear there's supposed to be a season 2 eventually, possibly on Netflix. And so it is important for us to remember to be grateful and be able to trust, grateful for and be able to trust in the our fellow Christians and people that God and other people that God has put into our lives to encourage us and help us, and for us to do the same for them, and be willing to be patient and wait for answers to our prayers and solutions to our circumstances. It is hard to say to anyone who is grieving, and it's hard to hear when grieving. But in those times, we need to be brave and have the faith and the patience to sit with one another as people grieve and show love to one another, whether that be in the smallest ways of waving and saying hi and saying, I hope you have a good day, or as well as being willing to make genuine sacrifices for others, whether that be make whether that be sacrificing your time, such as volunteering, or making food for making a meal for a family that is going through a hard time, for someone that is going through a hard time, and or even if there's not a solution, just letting someone know that you're their friend and that you love them and that you care about them. And we are told to do this for not only our friends and our family, but for everyone, as well as including the outcast, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, for even people who have done this have also done it for Jesus and have served Jesus, saints, and angels without knowing. And with that being said, I hope and pray that you take away from this lesson video the episode. I highly recommend the episode in this entire show of Erased. And there's a few scenes that I wouldn't recommend. It is heavier show, but with that being said, I hope and pray that you take away from this lesson video the episode and the passage of scripture from James chapter 5. Whatever God intended for you to take away from them. And with that being said, may God be with you, and I will see you next time. Bye.